FBI director arrested by racist police at airport. Police immediately beg and kneel. Director Maria Lawson stepped off the private jet, feeling the cold rush of air as the plane's door opened. She was finally back after a high-stakes security meeting in Washington, D.C. The briefing had been intense, and she had spent hours in discussions with top officials. Maria was used to the pressure, but today, something about the atmosphere felt different. As she walked across the tarmac, her polished shoes clicking against the concrete, she couldn't shake the feeling that today would bring an unexpected turn. She was a powerful woman, tough, sharp, and incredibly respected in her field. As the director of the FBI, Maria had worked tirelessly to fight crime and protect the country's most sensitive interests. She had earned the position through years of hard work, leading critical investigations, and gaining the trust of her peers. She wasn't just a leader, she was a symbol of strength. Yet, at this moment, as she stepped into the terminal, there was no hint of the chaos that was about to unfold. The airport was buzzing with the usual activity. Travelers moved hurriedly, heading to their gates, families greeted each other with warm hugs, and the security teams kept their eyes sharp. But for Maria, there was something in the air, something subtle, like a whisper just beyond her reach. It wasn't until she passed a group of officers that she felt it for the first time. Their eyes were fixed on her, and for a moment, it was as if time slowed down. Maria had been through many airports in her life, always walking with confidence, never letting the crowds or the whispers of security bother her. But today, she couldn't help but notice the shift in the air. A man in a police uniform, standing by the entrance, glanced over at her and whispered something to his partner. Maria couldn't hear the exact words, but she knew that the way they looked at her wasn't friendly. It was more like something was wrong, as though they had already decided who she was before she even spoke. She continued walking, her shoulders back, head held high. She was just another traveler now, heading home after a long trip. Her thoughts were with her family and the case she had been working on, but as she moved toward the exit, she couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled inside her. Suddenly, without warning, the officer who had been watching her stepped forward. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in a sharp voice, his hand raised, as if trying to block her path. Maria stopped, confused. There was something in his tone, something that didn't sit right. "Is there a problem, officer?" Maria asked, keeping her voice calm and composed. She wasn't the type to react without reason. She had seen it all before: racism, prejudice, and people who tried to use their position for power, but she didn't expect it here, not in a place like this. The officer looked her up and down, his eyes narrowing. "You're not allowed to leave the terminal until we finish questioning you," he said, his voice colder now. Maria raised an eyebrow. "Questioning me," she repeated. "On what grounds?" The officer didn't answer right away. He just motioned for another officer to step forward. By now, more of the airport security team had gathered around them. Maria could feel the tension rising. The moment felt wrong, everything felt wrong. The officer who had stopped her wasn't giving a clear reason. He wasn't following any of the procedures that should have been in place. The second officer, a woman with short, dark hair, stepped closer. "We need to check your bags," she said, her voice clipped. Maria could tell this wasn't just about security protocol. Something else was happening here. "I haven't done anything wrong," Maria replied, trying to keep the situation under control. She was used to being in situations where people tried to undermine her, but this was different. She wasn't just a regular person. She was the director of the FBI. People should have known who she was. The officer, however, wasn't backing down. "We'll need you to come with us," the man insisted. "We have reason to believe you might be carrying something suspicious." Maria's heart skipped a beat. Her instincts kicked in, and she knew something wasn't right. This wasn't just a random security check. This was something more. It was personal. She didn't let her voice show the worry that was growing inside of her. I'm the director of the FBI. I've been through countless security checks. You know who I am. She tried to make it clear that this was an unnecessary, baseless action, but the officer only seemed to grow more determined. No one's above the law, the man shot back. Please follow me, ma'am. Maria felt the anger rising inside her. She wasn't used to being treated like this. The officers had no reason to stop her, no reason to treat her like a criminal. And yet, there they were, standing in her way, as if her identity didn't matter. She had worked for years to break barriers and fight injustice. Now, she was being confronted with something that seemed like an unfair challenge, something she hadn't expected at this moment. As the officers continued to insist, Maria's thoughts raced. She knew what was happening. It wasn't just about the bags. It wasn't even about her identity as a high-ranking FBI agent. It was about something deeper, something about how people saw her because of her race and position. The more she thought about it, the more it became clear, they had decided who she was, and they had already assumed the worst. Is this really necessary? Maria asked, her voice still calm but firm. But the officers weren't listening. They were already preparing to take her in, despite her clear protests. At that moment, Maria knew she had no choice but to comply. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the terminal on her now. The situation had escalated beyond her control. With each passing second, it seemed as though the injustice of the moment was getting louder, and the crowd was beginning to take notice. Phones were being raised, cameras were capturing every angle of the unfolding drama. Just as Maria took a step toward the holding area, she noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was one of her colleagues from the FBI, a man she had worked with for years. His face went pale as he realized what was happening. He rushed toward the scene, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. "Director Lawson," he called out. His voice was calm, but his eyes were wide with concern. Maria's heart lifted a little at the sight of him. She had been right all along. This wasn't just a random check. This was something more, and she wasn't going to let it go without making sure the truth came out. "Who is this?" the officer asked, his voice wary as he eyed the newcomer. "This is Agent Jacobs," Maria replied, her voice still steady. "He works with me. I'm the director of the FBI. You've made a mistake." The officer hesitated for a moment, his face reddening as he realized his blunder. Agent Jacobs showed his badge and immediately began explaining the situation, presenting the proof of Maria's identity. The officer's arrogance was quickly replaced by embarrassment. Maria stood tall, but she could feel the weight of the injustice still lingering in the air. This wasn't over. It was only just beginning. As the scene unfolded in the airport, Director Maria Lawson stood still, feeling the weight of what had just happened. She was used to facing challenges head-on, but nothing had prepared her for the sudden, unjust arrest attempt by the police. Her mind raced, and her thoughts were scattered, but there was no time to think too much. The moment was happening now, and it wasn't just about her. This was about justice, integrity, and the very principles that she had spent her life upholding. The officer who had initially detained her, his face flushed with embarrassment, stood frozen as Agent Jacobs continued to speak with him, explaining her identity. Maria could see the change in the officer's demeanor, the sudden realization that he had made a monumental mistake. But despite the explanation, the damage had been done. The crowd around them was growing, and the whispers and murmurs of the onlookers were unmistakable. Maria felt her anger rising but did her best to keep it in check. She couldn't allow herself to lose control, not now. She was a leader, a symbol of authority, and she had to maintain that composure. But deep inside, she knew that something needed to change. This was bigger than just this incident. This was about every person who had ever faced the unjust weight of prejudice and bias, people who had been wronged simply because of who they were. The officer who had stopped her looked at the ground, his face a mixture of shame and regret. His partner, a woman who had been standing by silently, now shifted uneasily from foot to foot. Maria knew they were both caught in a situation they couldn't escape. The truth was clear, and there was no hiding from the reality of their actions. It was painful for them, no doubt, but Maria wasn't here to make them feel better. She was here to make sure that justice was served. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the officer finally spoke, his voice shaky. "We were just doing our job." Maria looked at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Your job is to protect and serve," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "You don't serve by making assumptions based on race or position. You serve by doing what's right. And what you did today wasn't right." Agent Jacobs, still speaking with the officer, quickly called for a supervisor to come to the scene. The airport security team had now gathered around, and the atmosphere felt tense. It wasn't just about the mistake anymore, it was about accountability. Maria knew that this was a moment for change, and she wasn't going to let it slip by without making sure everyone understood the importance of what had just happened. As they waited for the supervisor, Maria remained composed, but her mind was running. How many times had this happened to others? How many people had been treated unfairly, simply because of their skin color or their job? She had heard countless stories of discrimination, but this was different. This was happening to her. And as much as it stung, it also lit a fire inside her. She knew that this was her chance to make a real difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been unjustly treated. Soon, the airport supervisor arrived. He was a tall man, with a serious expression on his face. He quickly assessed the situation, looking at the officer, then at Maria. He immediately addressed the officer who had detained her. "What happened here?" the supervisor asked, his voice stern. The officer who had originally stopped Maria hesitated, unsure of how to explain what had just occurred. He started, but his words faltered. "Speak clearly," the supervisor demanded, his eyes narrowing. The officer cleared his throat and tried again. "We saw her walking through the terminal, and we thought she looked suspicious. We didn't recognize her, and," his voice trailed off as he realized how weak his explanation sounded. "I'm sorry. I made a mistake." Maria stood silently as the supervisor listened. Her heart was heavy, but she wasn't going to let them off the hook that easily. The public had already seen what had happened. The videos of the incident were already being shared online. There was no way to undo what had been done, but Maria knew that the response had to be one of accountability. The supervisor turned to Maria, his tone softening as he spoke to her directly. "Director Lawson, I deeply apologize for this. This was a grave error on our part, and I assure you that we will conduct a full investigation." Maria nodded, but her eyes never left the officers. "This isn't just about an apology," she said, her voice firm. "This is about making sure this never happens again. You need to ensure that your officers understand the importance of respecting everyone, no matter who they are." The supervisor nodded, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. "Yes, ma'am. We will take immediate action." Maria didn't allow herself to soften in that moment. This wasn't a time for mercy. This was a moment to demand change. She had a responsibility to make sure that the police department took the necessary steps to prevent such incidents in the future. "I want an internal review," Maria continued. "I want the public to know that this will be taken seriously. And I want these officers to undergo racial bias training immediately." The supervisor seemed to hesitate for a moment, but Maria's stare left no room for doubt. "This is non-negotiable," she said firmly. The officer who had stopped her looked like he was about to speak again, but his words caught in his throat. He had no excuse for what had happened. It was clear to everyone involved that this wasn't a mistake that could be easily swept under the rug. It was a problem that had been allowed to fester, and now it was out in the open for the world to see. Maria's phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't take it out. She knew that it was probably a call from someone higher up in the FBI, someone who had heard about the incident. But for now, she had a responsibility here, and she couldn't let her focus slip. This was too important. As the supervisor spoke with his team, arranging for the necessary steps to be taken, Maria took a moment to reflect on what had just happened. She had been wrongfully detained, humiliated in front of a crowd, and treated as if she didn't belong. But she had also taken a stand. She had used her position to demand change, to make sure that this wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a turning point. The crowd had begun to disperse as the situation calmed down, but the impact of what had occurred would last far longer. Maria wasn't going to let this moment fade into the background. This was the start of a conversation that needed to be had. It was time for the world to confront the reality of racial bias and take a stand against injustice. With one last look at the officers, Maria turned and walked away, her head held high. She had made it clear that this was just the beginning. And as she walked toward the exit, she knew that she was not just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been wronged in the same way. And she wasn't going to stop until things changed. The days following the incident at the airport were a blur for director Maria Lawson. The news had spread quickly, and soon, the entire country knew what had happened. The video of her being detained had gone viral, with people from all walks of life expressing their shock and disbelief at the injustice she had faced. While Maria was used to being in the spotlight, this was different. This wasn't about a public appearance or a new case being solved. It was about something much more personal and, in some ways, painful. Maria had been wrongfully detained because of who she was, and because of the color of her skin. The idea that someone in her position, someone with so much power and authority, could be treated like a common criminal simply because of these factors felt like a betrayal of the very system she had dedicated her life to. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been unjustly targeted, humiliated, or discriminated against. It was about the silent struggles that people faced every day, struggles that were often ignored or overlooked. Despite the heavy emotions she felt, Maria remained determined to use this moment for change. She wasn't going to let this incident fade into the background. The issue of racial bias in law enforcement was far from new, but it was something that still needed to be addressed head-on. She knew that this could be a turning point not just for her career, but for the entire law enforcement system. But the path to change was never easy, and Maria had a lot of work to do. As she sat in her office, going over the reports from the airport incident, Maria received a call from the police chief. The conversation was tense, and she could tell that he was feeling the pressure from all sides. He apologized again, reiterating how deeply sorry he was for what had happened. Maria listened carefully, but she didn't let his apology sway her. She knew that words alone weren't enough. Action was needed. "I appreciate your apology," Maria said calmly, her voice steady. "But apologies won't fix this. We need to make sure that this doesn't happen to anyone else. This is about accountability. It's about ensuring that your officers are trained to recognize bias and to handle every situation with respect and fairness." The police chief seemed to agree, but Maria could sense the hesitation in his voice. "We're committed to making changes," he said. "We've already started implementing new training procedures, and we'll be reviewing the actions of the officers involved." Maria knew that these were important first steps, but they weren't enough. She had worked too long in law enforcement to believe that a few changes to training would fix a systemic issue that ran deeper than just a few bad officers. She wanted to see real, lasting change, a change that would challenge the status quo and make sure that every officer, regardless of their rank or background, understood the importance of equality and justice. "Good," Maria said, "but I need more than just talk. I need to see that your department is committed to real reform. This goes beyond just bias training. It's about making sure that every officer understands the power they hold, and the responsibility they have to protect all citizens, no matter their race, gender, or background. The conversation continued for a while longer, with Maria outlining her expectations for the department's reform process. She wanted to see clear steps taken to hold officers accountable when they made mistakes, and she wanted to make sure that the public would have confidence that the department was truly committed to change. Maria knew that she couldn't let this slip away. The incident had sparked a conversation, but she needed to ensure that it wasn't forgotten. As the days passed, Maria's thoughts were consumed with the issue of racial bias in law enforcement. She began reaching out to other leaders in the field, as well as civil rights groups, to discuss what needed to be done. She didn't want to stand by and watch another injustice unfold. This was her moment to push for real, lasting reform, and she wasn't going to waste it. Meanwhile, the officers involved in the incident were placed on administrative leave, and an internal investigation was launched. The police department promised a thorough review of their actions, but Maria knew that there was more to be done. She couldn't allow the investigation to be a mere formality. It had to be an opportunity for real change. She was determined to ensure that the officers who had wrongfully detained her would face consequences, but also that the entire department would learn from this incident and improve its practices going forward. Maria's stance was clear. She wasn't asking for special treatment, nor was she looking for revenge. What she wanted was simple: equality, justice, and accountability. She wanted to make sure that no one else would ever have to endure what she had gone through that day at the airport. It wasn't about her, it was about making sure that the system worked for everyone, regardless of their race or background. As the investigation into the incident continued, Maria received a visit from the police chief. He came to her office, looking tense but determined to show that he was serious about making things right. He apologized once more for the actions of his officers, but this time, he brought a concrete proposal for how his department would move forward. He laid out a series of steps, including changes to their training programs, new policies for handling interactions with the public, and a commitment to transparency and accountability in all future incidents. Maria listened carefully, nodding occasionally. She could see that the chief was genuine in his desire to change, but she also knew that words were only part of the solution. What mattered now was action. "I appreciate the steps you're proposing," Maria said, "but we need to make sure that this is more than just a response to one incident. This has to be part of a larger movement to address the deep-rooted biases in our system. We can't just talk about change, we need to live it, every single day." The police chief agreed, and together, they began discussing ways to work together on a long-term plan for reform. It was clear that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Maria was determined to see it through. She had a responsibility to the public, to her team, and to herself to make sure that this wasn't just another story of injustice that faded into the background. In the following weeks, the issue continued to make headlines, and Maria became a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. She gave speeches, held meetings with community leaders, and worked tirelessly to ensure that the conversation about racial bias in law enforcement didn't stop with her incident. The country was paying attention now, and Maria wasn't going to let this moment pass without making sure that real change would follow. The officers involved in her wrongful detainment were eventually held accountable for their actions. They were reassigned, and the police department took the necessary steps to address the systemic issues that had allowed this to happen. Maria felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing that her fight had led to real consequences for those responsible. But she knew that this was just the beginning. Her efforts weren't just about one department, they were about creating a ripple effect that would spread across the country, influencing other law enforcement agencies to take a closer look at their practices and make real, lasting changes. Maria was determined to ensure that this wasn't just another chapter in a long history of injustice, it was the start of a new era. And she wasn't going to stop until the work was done. The days that followed Maria's meeting with the police chief were a whirlwind of action and reflection. She had never expected to be in the center of such a storm, but she knew that this was the moment she needed to act decisively. The media coverage of the incident had been intense, but now it was shifting toward the aftermath, the demands for accountability, for reform, and for justice. People were paying attention, and Maria knew she couldn't let this opportunity slip away. The police department had promised change, but promises alone weren't enough. Maria wasn't one to settle for just words, she needed to see real action. She had been through too much, had worked too hard in her career, to let this be another fleeting story that faded out of public view. She needed to make sure that the lesson of this moment would echo far beyond her own personal experience. The pressure was mounting on the police department. Public outcry had reached a fever pitch. People were demanding answers, real answers, and they were calling for consequences. Some of the officers involved in the wrongful detainment had been placed on administrative leave, but that was only the beginning. Maria knew that justice wasn't just about punishing those who had made a mistake. It was about preventing future mistakes, about creating a system that worked for everyone, regardless of who they were or where they came from. As the pressure grew, so did the desire for change. The department began to roll out their plan for reform. The police chief, after listening to Maria's demands and taking note of the public's expectations, began implementing a new set of policies aimed at addressing racial bias within the department. It wasn't just about training, it was about changing the very culture of the police force. Maria watched closely as the department worked to move forward. She knew that this wasn't a quick fix. These changes would take time, but she was determined to make sure that every step was taken with the seriousness it deserved. The department needed to rebuild trust with the community. It needed to show that it was committed to protecting and serving everyone, no matter their race, ethnicity, or background. It wasn't just about the police department anymore. The ripple effect of the incident had reached other parts of the country, with cities and towns across the nation beginning to take a closer look at their own law enforcement practices. Maria had become a symbol, not just of resilience in the face of injustice, but of the need for reform that was long overdue. People were listening to her, and she couldn't waste the moment. One evening, Maria was invited to a national conference on law enforcement reform, where leaders from across the country were gathered to discuss how to address systemic racism in policing. As she took the stage to speak, the room went quiet. Maria had been in many high-profile situations before, but this moment felt different. This wasn't just about presenting a report or delivering a speech. This was about making her voice heard on a matter that affected millions of people. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady and clear. "I stand here today not just as the director of the FBI, but as someone who has experienced firsthand the consequences of a system that is deeply flawed. What happened to me at that airport was not just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a larger issue that has been ignored for far too long. Racial bias in law enforcement is not a new problem. It's one that has been building for years, even decades, and it is time for us to finally face it head on." There was a murmur of agreement in the crowd. Maria could see the seriousness on their faces. They knew that the conversation about race and law enforcement had to change. It had to go beyond the usual discussions of policy. It had to include real action, real consequences, and most importantly, real accountability. "The incident at the airport was painful," Maria continued, "but it opened a door that has allowed us to have an honest conversation about the biases that exist within our police forces. We cannot afford to ignore this any longer. If we truly want to protect and serve all communities, then we need to make sure that every officer understands the importance of treating every individual with dignity and respect." As she spoke, Maria could feel the weight of the responsibility she carried. She was speaking for herself, but she was also speaking for everyone who had ever been wrongly accused, mistreated, or discriminated against simply because of their race. She wasn't just addressing the room, she was addressing the nation. And in that moment, she realized the magnitude of what she had to do. This wasn't just about one police department or one incident, it was about creating a movement, a shift in how the entire country viewed law enforcement and justice. The conversation continued for hours, with discussions about policy changes, new training programs, and ways to hold law enforcement agencies accountable. Maria participated fully, offering insights based on her own experience and the lessons she had learned along the way. She was determined to make sure that this wasn't just another conference with good intentions that would fade away. This was about building a system that would last, one that would protect everyone. Back at the airport, the officers who had been involved in her detainment were facing their own consequences. The internal investigation had concluded, and the department had decided to take action. The officers were reassigned to other duties, their actions reviewed in detail, and their future with the department uncertain. While Maria had always believed in second chances, she also knew that there had to be accountability for actions like these. The department had promised to make the necessary changes, and now it was time for them to follow through. But even as these changes were being implemented, Maria knew that the fight wasn't over. This wasn't just about one department or one group of officers. This was about changing the culture of law enforcement across the country. It was about ensuring that everyone, no matter their background, could walk into a police station or an airport or any other public space and feel safe, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically. They needed to know that they wouldn't be judged based on the color of their skin or the way they looked. Maria continued to use her platform to advocate for systemic change. She worked with community leaders, civil rights groups, and other law enforcement agencies to create a new framework for policing, one that emphasized fairness, transparency, and accountability. She was determined to see this through, no matter how long it took. As the weeks passed, the public's focus began to shift. The media, once quick to sensationalize the incident at the airport, now began to focus on the positive changes that were being made. Stories of law enforcement agencies implementing new training programs, officers taking part in bias reduction workshops, and communities working together to build trust started to surface. It was clear that things were changing, but Maria knew that there was still so much more work to do. One afternoon, Maria received a call from the police chief. He told her that they had begun to implement the changes she had suggested, and that the department was already seeing improvements. The officers had started to view their roles with a renewed sense of responsibility, and the public was beginning to notice. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Maria smiled as she hung up the phone. This was only the beginning, but she could feel the change in the air. The work she had done, the stands she had taken, and the conversations she had started were beginning to make a difference. It was a long road ahead, but Maria was ready for the challenge. She wasn't going to stop until she saw the justice she had fought for become a reality for everyone. As weeks passed after the airport incident, Director Maria Lawson's efforts began to bear fruit. The changes within the police department were becoming more than just surface-level adjustments. They were starting to reflect a deep shift in how the entire department viewed its relationship with the public and the values that guided their actions. Maria had spent years leading high-stakes operations, dealing with complex cases, and managing the delicate balance of law and justice. But this, what she was doing now, felt different. It was personal, and it was going to change more than just the department. It was going to change the future of law enforcement across the nation. Maria had always known that change was a long road, but she had never been one to shy away from a challenge. The lessons from the past were clear, and the system she had spent her life working within needed reform, not just because of what had happened to her, but because of the countless others who had suffered the same kind of injustice. The fight wasn't just about personal gain, it was about creating a better future for everyone, regardless of race, background, or identity. Maria continued to push forward with unwavering dedication. She knew that the changes that were being implemented in her own case had the potential to impact law enforcement across the country. She had become a symbol of the need for accountability and equality within the system. Everywhere she went, People spoke of her courage and her determination to create a safer and fairer world. But even with the accolades, Maria stayed grounded. She was focused on the work that still lay ahead. One afternoon, Maria found herself in a small conference room, surrounded by members of various civil rights groups, community leaders, and law enforcement officials. It was one of the many meetings that had become a part of her daily routine. But today, the conversation felt different. The energy in the room was electric. People were listening, and the solutions were beginning to take shape. As Maria listened to the speakers, she reflected on how far they had come. There was a time, not long ago, when these kinds of conversations would have been difficult to have. People wouldn't have been so open to hearing about the systemic issues that plagued law enforcement. But now, there was a willingness to listen, to acknowledge the problem, and to work together toward real solutions. Maria knew that this wasn't just about addressing one incident, it was about addressing a system that had been broken for far too long. It wasn't just about changing police procedures or offering better training. It was about shifting the very mindset that had allowed racism and bias to thrive in so many corners of law enforcement. And for that, Maria needed more than just policy changes. She needed to see a shift in hearts and minds. The meeting continued with discussions on new initiatives for law enforcement reform. Some were focused on community policing, others on creating new pathways for diversity and inclusion within police departments. Each idea was met with a mix of skepticism and hope, but what Maria saw most was a shared commitment to creating a future where bias no longer played a role in the way the public interacted with law enforcement. Maria spoke next, her voice calm but carrying the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. "We can't change the past," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "But we can create a future where justice doesn't depend on the color of someone's skin or their background. What happened to me at the airport wasn't just wrong, it was a reminder of the work we still have to do. We need to make sure that every person, no matter where they come from, feels that they are seen and respected by those who serve and protect them." Her words landed heavy in the room, and for the first time in what felt like a long while, there was a collective acknowledgement of the responsibility each person in that room carried. The work ahead wasn't easy, but the desire for change was stronger than ever. The meeting concluded with concrete action steps. New policies would be put in place, and departments across the country would be held accountable for the way they handled racial bias and discrimination. It wasn't just a discussion anymore, it was a movement. And Maria knew that her role in it wasn't over. She had to keep pushing, keep advocating for those whose voices had been ignored for far too long. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Maria began to see real results. The police department, which had once failed her, was now leading the charge for reform. The training programs they had implemented were showing results. Officers were engaging with their communities in ways that they hadn't before, working to rebuild the trust that had been broken. There were still challenges, of course. Old habits were hard to break, and the system was slow to change. But Maria felt a sense of progress that she hadn't felt in a long time. She had also noticed a shift in the public's perception of law enforcement. The media, which had once sensationalized her incident, was now focusing on the positive changes that were being made. Stories of officers engaging with community members, listening to their concerns, and taking active steps to prevent discrimination were making headlines. It wasn't just about highlighting the problems anymore, it was about shining a light on the solutions. Maria continued to work tirelessly, speaking at conferences, writing op-eds, and meeting with lawmakers. She wasn't just a symbol of reform, she was an active participant in shaping the future of law enforcement in the country. The conversations that had once been difficult to have were now happening everywhere, from local town halls to national stages. People were talking about the need for change, and most importantly, they were listening. One afternoon, Maria received an unexpected call from the police chief of the department that had wrongfully detained her. He thanked her for holding them accountable and for giving them the opportunity to reform. The department had made tremendous progress, and while there was still work to be done, they had learned valuable lessons from the incident. The chief promised that they would continue to strive for better, not just for their officers, but for the communities they served. Maria appreciated the call, but she knew that the true measure of success wouldn't be in words, it would be in action. It would be in the officers who woke up every day and chose to serve with fairness, compassion, and respect. It would be in the communities that felt heard, valued, and protected by the law. As the years went by, Maria's efforts continued to have a profound impact on law enforcement across the nation. While systemic change was slow, it was happening. She had started a conversation that was still ongoing, a conversation that would continue long after she was gone. Maria had become a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience, and most importantly, a catalyst for the change that so many people had been waiting for. She had come a long way from that moment at the airport, but she never forgot why she had started this journey in the first place. It was never about personal recognition or glory, it was about ensuring that everyone, no matter who they were, had the right to feel safe and respected by those who were sworn to protect them. Maria stood tall, proud of the work she had done, but knowing that the fight wasn't over. The road to equality and justice was still long, but with each step, she knew they were moving closer to the world they all hoped for, a world where no one would be judged by the color of their skin or the job they held. And for Maria, that was enough.